Good afternoon. My name is Steve Faust with 3J Consulting. This meeting regarding the Oak Lodge Incorporation for Equity project is taking place on Thursday, December 17th. Funding for this project is provided by Metro in response to a grant application prepared by the Oak Lodge Governance Project Steering Committee. EcoNorthwest was selected to conduct the work of this study, and I am managing the project on behalf of Metro. The purpose of this community feedback overview meeting is to review the scope of work that EcoNorthwest will be carrying out to achieve the project objectives and answer some of the questions generated by the Oak Lodge community. We will begin with a brief presentation from representatives of the steering committee and then spend the majority of our time on a presentation from EcoNorthwest about the scope of work for this project. And with that, I'll hand it over to Joseph and Mitra.
Hello, my name is Mitra Anusharavani, and I am a member of the Oak Lodge Governance Project. And with that, I'd like to introduce the other members of our steering committee. Joseph, if we can get the slide going. Yeah, here we are. If you are on this call, not everybody is present, please wave. Nathan Breitenfeld, who I don't believe is here. Valerie Chapman, who I also don't think is here. Jane Civiletti. Tom Civiletti, Joseph Edge, Nate Ember, Eleanor Hunter, Chips Janger, and Cole Merkel. All right, that's us. And with that, I'd like to give a little bit more detail about who this steering committee is. So first and foremost, we're residents of Oak Grove and Jennings Lodge, involved in various local groups and excited about the place in which we live. We're information seekers, curious about the implications of various governance options. And this curiosity has been prompted by previous efforts to explore incorporation, demographic shifts in the last decade, and the forecasted growth that we can expect in the upcoming years. As Steve mentioned, we are grant recipients, having received $100,000 from Metro to fund an economic and governance report intended to empower the community to have conversations about possibility within our urban unincorporated area. We're champions of community voices, believing the future of this area should be determined by those of us who live here, while genuinely listening through respectful discourse, which we believe is the keystone to successful engagement. We're nature lovers, intending to sustain, enhance, and preserve our beautiful habitat by elevating this value in our conversations. We're advocates for the economy, wanting to increase convenience and vibrancy for our area. We're promoters of equity, believing Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and Asian residents of various income levels, physical ability, and ages should be deliberately sought and given seats at the table in order to have truly transformative discourse. And we're livability idealists, thinking that through robust engagement, we can collectively identify the really important things that make it possible for us to live better and do more. So what we're specifically seeking from this grant is something concrete that we can share with everyone that gets to the heart of the community's questions about what it means to incorporate, annex, or maintain status quo. The Oak Lodge Governance Project is not launching a campaign in favor of any of those options. We are in favor of getting real-world data to begin these conversations about what's possible within our shared community. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Joseph to talk about some things that we've heard within our community.
Thank you, Mitra. So in November of 2020, the Oak Lodge Governance Project volunteers created a community survey form, and we advertised this in the Clackamas Review and also asked community leaders, including the two area CPOs, to distribute the link to the web survey over to their email list. In all, 86 people responded, with the vast majority of those respondents identifying as area residents and a few local business owners. Nearly 40% of the respondents' comments about economic issues related to the city's taxes and potential sources of revenue, with many hoping to learn about projected impacts from anticipated increases to taxes and fees. Over a third of respondents expressed a desire to see a straightforward pro-con comparison of the three options that are under study. And roughly a quarter of respondents asked questions about land use and zoning, including what might change and what we could change. Two of the common themes that we heard were really questions about what the authorities of the city are, with respondents really seeking to learn what cities can regulate, often in terms of land use. And we also heard a lot of questions about impacts or changes to the relationships with existing service providers, including our special service districts in the area. We found that residents want to see hard figures for a specific proposal so they can gauge individual impacts from new taxes and collective benefits from new revenue sources. There's a great deal of uncertainty about what a city can and cannot do and how residents will be involved in those processes. And there's also a sincere interest in being engaged throughout this exploratory process. So we believe it will be important to clarify the scope and purpose for this phase of research. Public input largely reflected the perception that this study represents a late-stage step towards a proposed change in governance. And many questions asked for certainty about proposed tax rates, service levels, land use plans, zoning changes, and more that are not the focus of this phase of study. Because we are not modeling all possible scenarios the public might want to consider, it will be important to clearly enumerate the benefits and value of answering the overarching research question guiding this study. Modeling should preserve the special service districts. Modeling for city-provided services should assume that the existing special service districts remain in place under current tax rates and boundaries. The Oak Lodge Water Services and North Clackamas Parks and Recreation districts enjoy a high rate of satisfaction among the public, and changes to these districts likely would not be supported by the public. In fact, Oak Lodge Water Service District's service area includes portions of Milwaukie and Gladstone. And NCPRD's service area includes all of Milwaukie, providing present-day examples for how the taxing districts could be structured. Again, much of the public input asked questions about or comments upon subject matter that is outside the scope of this study. Oak Lodge Governance Project volunteers will need to address this input with outreach and education opportunities for the public to learn how to participate in this process, why these issues are important and timely, as well as what role the city can play and how that is created. Underlying themes to much of the public input centered on the questions, what can happen as well as what will happen. With the former asking about what our possibilities are, and the latter trying to identify changes that may be compelled by law under a change in status, such as high-density zoning or construction of sidewalks. The final report would benefit from guidance relating to the high-level processes of annexing or incorporating and the relative timelines or touchstones for implementation, including changes to service providers such as law enforcement and street maintenance, tax rate adjustments, election of a city council and construction of a city hall, comprehensive land use planning and adoption of zoning, and other essential steps towards implementing each change in governance under study. With that, Beth, I'll hand it off to you.
Well, thank you very much. Before we get started, I would like to introduce the EcoNorthwest team. Only myself and Bob Parker are here today. Bob Parker is the project director for the project, and I'll ask him to introduce himself first.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Bob Parker, and as Beth said, I'm a project director with ECO, and looking forward to working on this.
Thank you. I'm a senior planner, and I'll be project managing this project with Bob. We'll also be working with Nick Popanook with Tiberius Solutions. Nick has a decade and more working in public finance, so he'll be helping us on those sorts of issues and the modeling and the analysis. We've also got John Morgan on our team, and John has spent his career helping cities essentially manage themselves. I'm not sure if he'd quite put it that way. But he's got decades of knowledge about that. And he also was the city manager for a period of time for the city of Damascus as it was trying to go through its incorporation process. So what I'm going to do is step through our brief PowerPoint about the scope of work. Pardon me as I rearrange all my windows here. So this is essentially covering the scope of work for the Oak Lodge Governance Options Project and going through that. So first, we see the question, the central question of the project is what governance option is best for the Oak Lodge area? And we're considering annexation into the city of Milwaukie potentially, incorporation of a new city, and remaining unincorporated in Clackamas County. We have done a small amount of outreach to the city of Milwaukie to make sure that they are on board with the idea of us talking about annexation of the area into the city. And what they have emphasized to us is very important is self-determination of the Oak Lodge area. In other words, they're open to the discussion, but it's essential that this be a locally driven project by the people of Oak Lodge. We also reached out to the city of Gladstone to make sure that they were okay with us not talking about annexation into Gladstone, as this area is much larger than the existing city of Gladstone, and they are on board with that also. So in each of the three scenarios, annexation, incorporation, and remaining unincorporated, we'll be looking at potential approaches from fiscal implications, that kind of thing, of each of these scenarios. So how are we going to evaluate them? What are we going to consider? Mostly about fiscal implications. We'll consider some things about future land uses, but that's not a focus of this project. Political considerations, public preferences, those are all pieces that will be discussed later on in a process beyond this project. So the important thing is this project starts by asking questions about the fiscal implications of the three options. It's a starting point for discussions with the people of Oak Lodge. It's answering some of the questions that Joseph just mentioned came up in the survey of residents in Oak Lodge. There'll be many, many future discussions about potential land uses, political considerations, decision-making processes, and public preferences. This project at some level is going to answer some of the base questions that people living in Oak Lodge may have about these options. I think it will spur many, many more questions, which is certainly the way for the area to go through evaluating what it wants to do. Looking at our scope of work, which we are revising very slightly to address the questions that we've heard from Joseph and Mitra, and to make it clearer where we can. We're looking at answering the following questions. What are the taxes and the fees that would be imposed by each of the three governance options? What would the rates be potentially? How much revenue would be raised? And importantly, how much of that future revenue could reasonably expected to be invested back into the community? Looking at the different options, what are the different administrative and overhead costs of each option? For example, is one option one that would consume 5% of the projected local revenue versus another option might consume significantly more than that? We'll be weighing those differences. So an important consideration here is equity. And equity for each of the governance options, how does it differ for representation and taxation? What are the potential impacts on lower income households and minority populations? Are there meaningful differences in the access to power and decision-making or taxation and the distribution of services among the governance options? Is there one governance option that's more or less progressive? I think there'll be a lot more questions about equity that we may not address in this project, but we'll certainly pose them as additional and future questions. How might each governance option affect the property values in the study area? How might it affect housing development, especially development of affordable housing? We'll be able to answer some of those questions, and some of the questions more detailed about development of housing and affordable housing would be things that would be more likely to be answered in future projects. How might each of the options affect local control? So how much local control do the people of Oak Lodge have under each of the different options? So looking at some of the key assumptions that we're talking about here, we're focusing obviously on fiscal implications. We'll consider where we can other issues. There'll probably be qualitative considerations, such as impact on land use patterns or potential development, different types and levels of public services. We're proposing to hold constant a few very important considerations. One, we're proposing to evaluate one geographic boundary where we can bring information about sub areas. We will bring that information forward, but our scope of work and the budget for the project really requires that we hold the boundary stable, generally speaking. We'll be using Metro's forecast for population growth and household growth, as well as employment in our study area. We're proposing to hold stable land uses. So one of the big sets of questions is what will future housing or business be in the region or in the city, the potential city, sorry. And we won't necessarily be able to answer that. We may have ideas, thoughts about that, but we won't be answering that specifically. The exception is that we'll consider Clackamas County's expectations for residential development changes resulting from House Bill 2001 along McLaughlin in the commercial zone. And then we will we'll be comparing services on a service by service basis, holding some services the same, but other services may be different in the different scenarios. One of the questions that we had raised is why are we considering differences in services in something like police, but not fire and emergency medical services? Well, police is something that would be likely done locally, either by the new city or by the city of Milwaukie if the area annexed into Milwaukie, whereas fire and emergency medical services are regional services, like TriMet's a regional service. So it wouldn't vary based on the results of the three scenarios. So we'd be holding those stable. The same thing goes for holding parks and recreation, education, and library services stable. So our scope of work is from our perspective, fairly simple. We've got a project kickoff, which we're engaged in at this point. We've started collecting data, so getting information from the different cities, figuring out all the taxing districts in the area, and gathering all of that information. What we'll be doing in task 3 is organizing our information around the 3 governance options and developing a framework for how we're going to approach the evaluation. What will our considerations be? What will we be changing in different scenarios? Task 4 is model development and actually executing that evaluation. And in task 5, we'll be producing draft and final reports. We will have a peer reviewer of the report who will provide feedback to us, and we'll also be making a presentation of the results. In doing this the way we're doing this, what we're trying to do is, to the extent possible, focus on what the issues are in a technical sense. So what are the issues are as they relate to fiscal and financial decisions. And many other decisions will have to come after this. One of the discussions that we had at our first meeting, I'm actually going to bring up this map in a different format in a moment, is what would the boundaries be for the study area? And first of all, please ignore our label here. We know that this is not Kellogg Creek. It's just where the GIS puts the label. So these boundaries are ones that we have on an interactive map that you can access through this URL, where we can look at each of the 3 boundaries that have been proposed by this committee. So we've got the Oatfield Ridge boundary, which runs here along the ridge between Milwaukie and other parts of unincorporated Clackamas County. We've got the road access boundary, which I keep, that road, give me one moment. I keep forgetting the name of the road, is the Aldercrest Road or Upper Aldercrest Road in general. So that follows along Aldercrest or Upper Aldercrest. And then we've also got the Kellogg Creek boundary. Those are 3 potential boundaries to the north. We have some suggestions and some thoughts on this and hope to speak about that in a few moments. I'm going to turn off Kellogg Creek and Oatfield for a moment. The southern boundary was also a question. Would we go up to the city of Gladstone and include this area, which is the urban growth management area for Gladstone, an area where Gladstone would expect to expand in the future? Or would we have a boundary that stopped right about here? So it didn't come into this urban growth management area. We've had an opportunity to talk with the city of Gladstone and ask if they have objections to us considering the urban growth management area along here in the study area, and they don't have objections to us considering it. If that area, as part of the whole area, eventually chose, say, to annex, to incorporate, of course, there would be discussions that would have to happen with Gladstone and other involved entities about the urban growth management agreement and changing it. The other thing you should notice is that in the road access boundary, there's a little bit of Milwaukee's urban growth management agreement area in there. And in the Kellogg Creek, there's more of it in there. So those would require some discussion with the city of Milwaukie as well. I'll set that off to the side for the moment. And then I want to emphasize that while we hope to bring a lot of useful information to the public about the questions that are being asked, there's a lot of information that's going to have to be examined in future studies or through future discussion. So are there different governance options for the sub areas within the larger study area? How will land use and zoning change, and will residents have input into development for the plans for change? As a planner, I would certainly hope that residents would have input, but that goes to what the governance options are. Will there be more affordable housing? Will there be more in different businesses? Those both go to changes in land use potentially. How will parks, schools, transportation, water, wastewater, and other services change? We'll be presenting some information in this study, but we won't be providing recommendations specifically about how those will change. That will be part of future discussions. And how will decisions be made in the future, and will residents have more direct control? And that will come down to which governance options the area is considering. So all of these questions would be answered well after this study would be completed. Before I continue on and open it up for questions, I'd like to ask Bob if he has anything he'd like to add.
Yeah, I think our intent with this is to provide analysis that serves as a foundation for an ongoing dialogue. And one of our key objectives is to make sure that the technical analysis is defensible and understandable, so that it becomes a foundational base of data for the community to start having these more complex conversations. And I anticipate there's a lot of really complicated issues that are associated with this project, but one of them is going to be the tension between the cost of different options and local control, I think, and that's essential. And some of them are relatively self-evident. I think, for example, if you've got an incorporated city, you've got more control over land use than you do being unincorporated or potentially being in Milwaukie. Part of the reason we're not looking at land use options is there's just too many possibilities there given on that. So we use an approach called marginal analysis, where we try and hold elements constant so that it allows valid comparisons between your different options. So that's really what we're angling towards with this technical piece.
So then I would like to hand it back over to Steve and Joseph and Mitra. I'm going to unshare my screen.
Joseph or Mitra, do you have any follow-up questions for Beth?
So it would be fair to say with the marginal analysis that really what we're trying to discover with this is really the cost of creating a new city versus the cost of joining a city like Milwaukie that already exists. And so what would be the startup cost, essentially, that would give us that extra element of local control that we might not get by joining a city that's already been in place for many years. Is that a fair way of saying that?
I would emphasize that the startup costs aren't the focus. It's as much as anything the ongoing cost, but the startup costs have to be considered.
Yeah, and that's part of the marginal difference, of course, Joseph, because it's the startup costs of incorporating a new city are not trivial, because you're setting up an entire new government, you're creating a land use plan, you're setting up new administrative systems, new municipal services, and all those things. And those are going to clearly be considerations. And I think it's pretty easily stated at this point that those costs are not going to be associated. There'll be a different set of costs that are associated with things like annexation. So that is clearly a consideration here. And some of those costs, there's other elements that go along with that I think we'll look at in more of a qualitative approach. Just so as issues that we can't put numbers on come up, we can still compare the options and discuss the implications of those different options.
And I would say that some of the costs that we're talking about may not actually be financial costs. So the costs of coming to agreement as a community on a comprehensive plan and land uses, those are political and social costs.
Beth, I don't know if I heard you say that you had more to say potentially about recommendations on boundaries of the study.
I was hoping to discuss potential boundaries of the study and show you a little bit more of the information that we collected about the boundaries.
I'd like to hear more.
Okay.
Great.
So, pardon me, I will reshare my screen now. So obviously it's clear, and we can all agree that the boundary of the river is certainly a boundary. We're not talking about jumping. So from a lot of perspectives, I suspect I'll leave all three of these on. I'm going to look at the tax codes, the taxing districts. So you can see how in the southern part, you've got this one taxing district that overlaps both of these areas. A lot of your area is in this taxing district. And then the boundary with Milwaukie, you end up with a long, thin taxing district. It seems to me perhaps most sensible to follow the road boundary rather than the Kellogg Creek boundary that extends a lot further into Milwaukee's UGMA. But the Oatfield Ridge boundary seems to exclude what may well be some important areas to consider, which is why we were thinking that the the road access boundary on Aldercrest Road may be the most appropriate to use. If we look at the neighborhood community areas, let me turn off tax codes and see what we can get. Pardon me, you get a lot of things layering on top of each other. You can see what we've got here is essentially, the Oak Grove Council area and the Jennings Lodge. The Oak Grove Council area is hidden a little bit below the UGMA, but it seems to, generally speaking, well, it does go up and around that part of the Milwaukie UGMA. But that covers a lot of the area we're talking about.
And Beth mentioned the urban growth management areas. There's also urban growth management agreements that exist between the municipalities and the county and potentially Metro. Maybe Ted knows the answer to that. That lay out planning authority and other issues, and those would need to be amended if those areas were considered for incorporation. So that's another political process that would come into play.
And let me mention what the boundaries of the study area means for the project is if we're, say, using the Oatfield Lodge, Oatfield Ridge boundary, then we're only looking at businesses and dwelling units that are within that boundary, and calculating what the future revenues might well be from property taxes, et cetera. Whereas to go to the other side, if we were using the Kellogg Creek boundary, it would include a larger share, a larger number of households, more households in this area. In the future, if the area decided to incorporate, then I would imagine the boundary lines would almost certainly be different from whatever we propose in this project, at least, one parcel different. And perhaps significantly different. Perhaps there's reasons for that Gladstone might not want another city, for instance, exactly up against its city limits. And that would presumably be some negotiation about the Gladstone Urban Growth Management Agreement. So that's the additional information that I had, Mitra.
Oh, go ahead, Joseph.
So some of the feedback that we received asked a rather pertinent question, and it's one that we kind of asked amongst ourselves, which is what would be a reason to not consider the eastern boundary being I-205?
Let's see. I think this is 205 over here. Mm-hmm. We'd have to decide how it would cut up, but I mean, we could certainly come over to 205. I question, or my question back to you is that the people who live in this area, broadly speaking, do they consider themselves part of the Oak Grove and Oak Lodge, Jennings Lodge area?
And that's a fair question that probably has a complicated set of answers. We have some history with the McLaughlin area plan and that planning effort and the ongoing map it implementation team work that did include the CPO from that side of Oatfield Ridge in our work, but they are inactive and so have not been sending participants over for several years. So that's a question without an easy answer, but we did see that recommendation come up a couple times in the input. Is why not consider 205 as the eastern boundary? So
I would also note that it would be taking in a much larger portion of the Milwaukie urban growth management area, and you might start to run into some conflicts with Milwaukie over that, because presumably Milwaukie is considering that area as it's doing future planning.
And we don't need to come to a conclusion on the study area boundary today, but it's helpful to see all these different options that we'll be considering as we make a decision in the near future. Joseph?
Yeah, we certainly appreciate that. Thank you.
Sure.
Joseph, go ahead.
That link is available for anybody who would like to look at it and turn on and off some of the some of the layers, and that link is right here in the PowerPoint.
Thank you, Beth. Joseph and Mitra, do you have any other follow-up questions for Beth at this time?
I don't.
So we did have some input, and and we've received other questions just from people in the community about how our relationships with existing service providers, such as the Oak Lodge Water Services District, might change as a result of this. And so we thought we'd ask you to discuss that a little bit. One of the things that we kind of assumed as a community is that we would be leaving Oak Lodge Water Services alone to function as they do today because of high customer satisfaction levels and a good relationship with the community. And so we were just wondering if you could talk about that a little bit in terms of the service level assumptions as part of the study and what your recommendation is there.
So I think this is something for further discussion. I was talking with Nick Popanook about this the other day, and saying, should we consider if we're looking at the annexation into Milwaukie, should we consider that the water services stay the same, or should we consider the possibility of them changing? And Nick's thought on this was, if we don't consider the possibility of them changing, then you don't have the information about that. And would it be a disservice if we didn't provide that information so that you could, broadly speaking, the community, could make whatever decisions they need to make in the context of having that information. I want to emphasize that EcoNorthwest and our partners will not be making specific recommendations out of this, but are trying to model differences so you can see what the differences might be among the scenarios. So I think the concern is, if we don't examine it at all, is that is a disservice to the community by not providing any information.
My thought on it, Joseph, is there's a really high probability that you would just want to leave the district alone in this because they're not already an established utility provider. But as Beth said, if you really want to have good actionable information, looking at the alternative makes sense. I think the piece we have to be careful about here is signaling intent, right? Because as Beth said, we're not going to make recommendations, and we need to be clear that just by virtue of doing that analysis, we're not signaling intent for any changes to the district. And of course, if that does happen, there are statutory requirements for consultation between local governments, including service districts. So that would be a whole nother set of negotiations that would have to occur with the associated costs and legal issues that go along with it. But from a strict service provider standpoint, we think it makes sense to do the analysis.
So there's certainly value in, while we're conducting this research during this phase of study, to including that analysis in our modeling while we're at it is the recommendation.
That's our suggestion, yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you for that clarification. I appreciate that.
Something else that I'd like to just clarify too is that, we're talking about sort of these all or nothing scenarios with that we're not able to accommodate multiple variations of boundaries. Some of the, not an insignificant amount of feedback we've received has been, does the whole area have to do the same thing? What if one small area wants to do this thing and that thing and the other? And if I'm understanding correctly, that's not an option simply because of the constraints of the grant. There just aren't enough resources to fund every possibility available, correct?
Mostly yes, but a little bit no.
Okay.
So the mostly yes is we won't be doing sub-area analysis in detail. But I'm expecting some of the results to be such that we could say, well, if you had half this many people, you would have roughly half this much revenue. And where you had something that was financially feasible before, you have something now that's financially infeasible. And so there's ways of looking at it and doing that kind of testing on it, rather than saying this specific area here, this specific area there. So I think that it can help inform that discussion somewhat, but it's not going to give as much detail as I think people would like.
Thank you.
So it's
In our report, we will clearly state assumptions and frame this out. So, and what Beth said is way different than jumping to the conclusion that there's only one boundary that can be considered as the community makes decisions or choices about what to do next. Those are two separate things, right? But for the purpose of analysis, holding the boundary constant allows us to then make better comparisons between the three governance options. But we'll make it very clear that that is simply an analytical assumption that we made, and that there are no constraints on discussions about what the actual boundaries would be for this. It's conceivable that you could choose to do all three of the governance options. That part of it would incorporate, that part of it would annex into Milwaukie or Gladstone, and part of it would remain unincorporated. Might not be the least complicated approach you could choose, but there's a lot of variation. So this begins to hopefully communicate some of the complexities that we're confronted with as we move into doing the technical part of this study.
Joseph and Mitra, any other questions for Beth and Bob?
Not from me.
Joseph?
Nope, I don't think so. I think we've covered our bases really well. Thank you for your presentation and responding to the questions that we received and relayed to you.
Certainly.
Mitra,
Thank you for
Joseph,
the opportunity.
Oh, sorry, Beth.
No, go ahead.
Just wondering if you wanted to say any final words about kind of your immediate next steps in communication with the broader community.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're considering this study essentially phase one of a to be determined number of phases, depending on how conversations continue, fully acknowledging that there will at the very least be a phase two in which this study is published and there's public engagement around the data. And so in the meantime, the steering committee is making it incumbent upon ourselves to build really solid communication tools, including a website, email lists, a robust social media presence, and potentially a newsletter, while also including and recruiting folks who are interested in being a part of this. And we can expect to really launch public engagement come summer 2021, when we can expect the report. And we're excited to have these conversations with concrete data, and we're looking forward into sharing that conversation with the broader Oak Lodge community.
Thank you, Mitra and Joseph and steering committee. Thank you, Beth and Bob, for your presentation. We hope this was informative for people and answers a lot of questions, and know that there are more conversations to come. And with that, we'll say good afternoon.
Good afternoon. Thank you.